For most of the last 50 years, Canada's dollar has traded at roughly 70 to 80 cents against the American dollar. That gap was never just a currency fluctuation. It was a structural signal that Canada's economy moved when America's economy decided to move, that Canadian exports were priced for American consumption, and that Canadian industrial policy was built around one assumption, that the neighbor to the south would always be open for business. The man now leading the country knows this better than almost anyone alive. He ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis. He ran the Bank of England through the upheaval of Brexit. He has spent his entire professional career managing the consequences of other people's economic decisions, steadying institutions when the ground shifts beneath them, buying time, absorbing shocks, keeping systems functional under pressure. That is what central bankers do. They do not make bets. They manage risk, which is what makes what this leader is doing right now so striking. Because what Canada's new Prime Minister is proposing is not a tariff response. It is not a diplomatic repositioning. It is a structural economic reorientation, a deliberate attempt to end the dependency model that has defined Canada's relationship with the United States since before the original free trade agreement, and to build something that can stand on its own terms. And the man doing it is not a firebrand. He is not a populist. He is the most credentialed economic establishment figure Canada has produced in a generation. That contradiction is the story, and by the end of this exploration, you will understand exactly what he is doing, why he is doing it now, why he specifically is the person doing it, and what the real cost will be if this pivot either succeeds or fails. Let's start with what the 70 cents era actually was, because it was never as simple as an exchange rate. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border in the world and the largest bilateral trading relationship in history. At its peak, roughly 3/4 of all Canadian exports went to the United States. Not to Europe, not to Asia, not to the broader community of industrialized nations, but to one country across one border. Canadian manufacturing, Canadian energy, Canadian agriculture, Canadian lumber, all of it priced, timed, and structured around American demand cycles. That is not a trade relationship. That is a dependency architecture, and it was built deliberately. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement of 1988 and then the North American Trade Pact in 1994 were not just trade deals. They were integration blueprints. Canadian producers got guaranteed access to the largest consumer market on Earth. American companies got guaranteed access to Canadian resources at competitive prices. The arrangement worked in the sense that it generated growth, employment, and stability. But it worked the way a fixed gear works. Efficient in one direction, fragile when conditions change. Canadian economists warned about this for decades. The productivity gap, the persistent difference between Canadian output per worker and American output per worker, was a known structural problem. Canada was selling raw resources and semi-finished goods southward at volume, rather than developing the higher-value manufacturing technology and service sectors that generate compounding economic returns. The 70-cent dollar was not a coincidence. It was the market's ongoing verdict on that structural choice. Every government saw the data. Almost none of them changed the underlying structure because changing it was expensive, disruptive, and politically risky. And as long as the American market stayed open, there was always a reason to wait. Then the administration in Washington stopped making it easy to wait. On March 4, 2025, the United States government imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, automobiles, consumer products, citing national security provisions that Canada's trade negotiators described in diplomatic language as legally unprecedented. The Canadian auto sector, which had spent 30 years integrating its supply chains directly with American manufacturers, was facing a cost shock. It had no short-term mechanism to absorb. Ontario's manufacturing corridor, the stretch of industrial capacity running from Windsor through Hamilton to the eastern suburbs of Toronto, was looking at a structural disruption that no previous government had prepared it for. This was the trigger. But here is where the story gets more complicated than the headlines suggested, because by the time those tariffs landed, the new Prime Minister had already been thinking about this problem not as a political crisis to manage, but as a structural opportunity to exploit. He won the party leadership on March 9, 2025, 5 days after the tariffs hit. His campaign platform was not built around the tariff response. His campaign platform was built around a diagnosis of Canadian economic vulnerability that he had been developing for years, rooted in his academic work, his central banking experience, and his deep familiarity with how mid-sized open economies either adapt or decline when their primary trading relationships become unreliable. He had watched the United Kingdom spend 4 years in a post-Brexit economic fog, a country that also believed it had a special permanent relationship with its largest trading partner, and discovered that special relationships in trade are only as durable as the political will that maintains them. He had watched Canada from the outside making the same structural assumption. The tariffs did not create his agenda. They gave him a mandate to execute it. So, what is he actually doing? Because this is where most of the coverage has been thin. The phrase "boost local industry" sounds like a campaign slogan. What his government has put forward is more specific than that and more consequential. First, the domestic procurement framework. The federal government is the single largest purchaser of goods and services in the Canadian economy. The administration has moved to redirect a significant portion of federal procurement away from American suppliers toward Canadian ones, not across the board but in targeted sectors where Canadian capacity exists or can be rapidly developed. This is not a new idea. Canada has flirted with procurement nationalism before. What is different this time is the scale, the specificity, and the political will to absorb the short-term cost increases that come with it. Second, the infrastructure investment signal. He has tied infrastructure spending directly to industrial strategy, not just building roads and bridges, but deliberately routing capital toward the supply chain gaps that Canadian overdependence on United States trade has created. The critical mineral sector is the clearest example. Canada sits on some of the largest deposits of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements in the world, materials that are central to the global energy transition and to semiconductor manufacturing. For decades, those resources were either sold raw to American processors or left undeveloped. The government is now pushing to develop domestic processing capacity, positioning Canada not as a raw materials exporter, but as a value-added supplier to multiple global buyers. Third, the trade diversification push. This is the most complex and the longest-dated piece of the strategy. He has accelerated diplomatic and trade discussions with the European Union under the existing Comprehensive Economic and Trade Framework, with Indo-Pacific partners under the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and with a short list of bilateral partners whose interest in Canadian energy and agricultural exports has been growing precisely because American trade policy has become unpredictable. Canada is not walking away from the United States market, but it is for the first time in a generation seriously building the infrastructure, legal, diplomatic, and logistical, to route Canadian exports in multiple directions. Now here is what makes this more than just a policy announcement list. The question is not whether these moves sound sensible. They do. The question is whether they represent a genuine structural departure, or whether they are a more sophisticated version of the same gesture every Canadian government has made since 1994, which is to acknowledge the dependency problem and then quietly preserve it because the short-term cost of change is too high. And to answer that question, you need to understand one specific thing about this man that most of the coverage has missed entirely. He is not a politician who became an economist. He is an economist who became a politician, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding how he is making decisions right now. When he ran the Bank of Canada, his defining move was not conventional. In 2009, facing a global financial system in freefall, he made an unconventional commitment, a forward guidance pledge, that the bank would hold interest rates at a fixed level for a defined period of time, regardless of short-term data fluctuations. It was a credibility bet. He was saying the uncertainty itself is the problem, and I am going to reduce uncertainty by making an irreversible public commitment so that businesses and consumers can plan around it. That same logic is running underneath his current economic strategy. By making the pivot away from United States dependency loud, specific, and publicly committed rather than quiet, tentative, and reversible, he is trying to create the same kind of forward guidance effect in industrial policy that he used in monetary policy. He is trying to shift the planning horizon of Canadian businesses, investors, and trading partners by making the new direction feel durable enough to bet on. Whether that works in industrial policy the way it worked in monetary policy is genuinely an open question. Central bank credibility and government credibility are not the same thing. A Bank of Canada commitment survives elections. An industrial policy agenda does not if the next government reverses it. But the logic is coherent and it is more sophisticated than anything Canada has seen from a Prime Minister on economic structure in a very long time. There is, however, a serious counter-argument, and it deserves honest treatment. The counter-argument is this: Canada's integration with the United States is not a policy choice that can be unwound by a procurement framework and a critical minerals strategy. It is a physical, logistical, contractual, and cultural reality that took 60 years to build. The supply chains running through Windsor and Hamilton were not designed with alternative destinations in mind. The pipelines, rail lines, and port infrastructure that move Canadian goods were built around American endpoints. Redirecting that flow is not a matter of political will. It requires capital investment at a scale that takes decades, not terms, to deliver. And in the meantime, in the years between announcing the pivot and achieving it, Canadian consumers will pay higher prices for goods that were previously sourced cheaply from American suppliers. Canadian manufacturers will face higher input costs as procurement nationalism raises the price of domestic sourcing, and Canadian workers in the sectors most exposed to United States tariff retaliation will not be insulated from the disruption by a long-term strategy that has not yet materialized. A former finance minister who served under the previous administration before a very public break has been one of the voices threading this needle, arguing that economic sovereignty and trade pragmatism are not opposites, but that the sequencing of the pivot matters enormously. Move too fast and you create a cost shock that turns public opinion against the entire project. Move too slow and the political window closes before the structural change takes hold. The current leader's bet is that the tariff moment has given him a window of public support for short-term pain that no previous Canadian Prime Minister has had. The question, and this is the open loop that will define his government, is how wide that window actually is, and whether he can move fast enough to deliver visible results before it closes. So, let's talk about the window, because that is where this story either holds together or falls apart. He won a federal election in April 2025 with a mandate that was in significant part built around the argument that Canada needed to stop outsourcing its economic sovereignty to Washington. That is not a paraphrase. That was the explicit framing of his campaign, and Canadian voters watching 25% tariffs land on their auto sector, while a sitting American president referred to their country as a potential 51st state, gave him something that is genuinely rare in Canadian federal politics: a clear, emotionally charged public mandate for economic nationalism. That mandate is real, but mandates are not permanent. They are political capital, and political capital has a burn rate. The regions most exposed to what he is proposing are not uniformly enthusiastic about it. Alberta, whose economy remains heavily weighted toward energy exports, a significant portion of which flows southward, has watched the pivot conversation with particular weariness. Alberta's premier has been explicit. Any federal industrial strategy that raises the cost of doing business with the United States without first securing alternative markets at comparable volume is not economic sovereignty. It is economic disruption dressed in nationalist language. That tension between federal ambition and regional exposure is not a minor political footnote. It is the structural fault line that has undermined every previous attempt at Canadian economic diversification. And then there is the productivity question, which is the honest, uncomfortable foundation underneath all of this. Canada's productivity gap relative to the United States is not new data. The gap measuring output per hour worked has been widening since the mid-2000s. By 2024, Canadian workers were producing roughly 72 cents of output for every dollar produced by their American counterparts. That number is not a coincidence, and it is not primarily explained by the exchange rate. It is explained by decades of underinvestment in the higher value sectors, technology, advanced manufacturing, research and development that generate compounding productivity returns. The dependency on United States trade did not cause this gap, but it enabled it, because as long as Canadian raw materials and semi-processed goods had guaranteed access to the American market at competitive prices, there was no urgent structural pressure to move up the value chain. The dependency was comfortable. It insulated Canadian industry from the kind of competitive pressure that forces productivity investment. What he is proposing, if it works, would remove that insulation, which means the short-term pain is not just about tariff disruption. It is about forcing Canadian industry to compete at a level it has been partially sheltered from for 30 years. That is a harder sell than Buy Canadian, and it is the part of the agenda that does not fit on a campaign poster. Now let's look at where the pivot is already showing measurable movement, because there is one sector where the numbers are not theoretical. Canada's critical minerals strategy has been in development since the previous government's last term, but the current administration has accelerated it with specific capital commitments and a named list of priority projects. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth processing facilities, the infrastructure needed to turn raw extraction into value-added supply, are now receiving federal backing at a scale that has attracted serious attention from European and Asian manufacturers looking to reduce their own dependency on Chinese-controlled supply chains. The logic is genuinely compelling. The global electric vehicle supply chain, the semiconductor manufacturing base, and the renewable energy infrastructure build-out all require materials that Canada has in significant quantity. China currently controls a dominant share of the processing capacity for these materials. The United States is aggressively trying to build alternative supply chains under its own industrial policy frameworks. Canada sits in a position where it can supply both the American market and alternative buyers if it builds the processing infrastructure to do so. This is the one area where the pivot has a near-term commercial logic that does not depend on ideology. It is not about economic nationalism for its own sake. It is about positioning Canada in a global supply chain restructuring that is happening regardless of what any Canadian government decides. The question is whether Canada captures value in that restructuring or simply sells raw materials to whoever builds the processing capacity first. Two countries have quietly signaled serious interest in accelerated partnership with Canada on this front: Japan and Germany. Both are running their own versions of the same supply chain diversification problem. Both have existing trade frameworks with Canada through the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Comprehensive Economic Agreement respectively, and both have domestic political pressure to reduce reliance on Chinese-controlled materials and unpredictable American trade policy simultaneously. The conversations are not yet at the level of signed agreements, but they are further along than the public coverage has suggested. So what are the actual forward scenarios here? Because this is where the analysis has to be honest about genuine uncertainty, rather than defaulting to either optimism or doom. Scenario 1. The pivot holds and compounds. He secures a second term. The critical mineral strategy delivers visible investment and employment within 2 to 3 years, and at least one major non-United States trade agreement is deepened or expanded under his government. Canadian public tolerance for short-term cost increases holds because the economic case becomes visible before the political window closes. Alberta's energy sector finds alternative buyers at sufficient volume to reduce its exposure to United States tariff risk. In this scenario, the 70-cents era ends not with a declaration but with a structural reality. Canada's export mix is genuinely more diversified, and the dependency architecture that defined the post-1994 decades is measurably weakened. This scenario is possible. It is not guaranteed. It requires sustained political will across at least 2 electoral cycles, capital investment at a scale that has not yet been fully committed, and a degree of regional cooperation, particularly with Alberta, that the Prime Minister has not yet fully secured. Scenario 2, the partial shift. He delivers meaningful movement in critical minerals and federal procurement, but the deeper structural integration with the United States proves too embedded to redirect at the pace his mandate demands. The political window narrows after the first term. A subsequent government pulls back from the more aggressive elements of the strategy, preserving the wins in critical minerals while quietly restoring the dependency architecture in manufacturing and energy. Canada ends up with a slightly more diversified economy than it had in 2024, but not the structural reorientation that was promised. The 70-cents era fades rather than ends. This is historically the most likely Canadian outcome. Not because Canadians lack ambition, but because the structural inertia of deep trade integration has defeated every previous government that attempted something similar. Scenario 3, the overcorrection. The domestic procurement framework raises input costs faster than alternative supply chains develop. Regional tensions, particularly in Alberta and in the auto sector communities most exposed to United States retaliatory measures, generate political pressure that forces the government to either retreat from the strategy or double down at the cost of its coalition. Consumer prices rise visibly. The public narrative shifts from economic sovereignty to economic mismanagement. The pivot becomes politically toxic before it delivers structural results, and the next government runs on restoring the relationship with Washington. This scenario is the one the sequencing argument was designed to prevent. and it is not a remote possibility. It is what happens when the pace of disruption outstrips the pace of visible benefit, which is a risk in any structural economic transition, regardless of how well designed the underlying strategy is. Here is what connects all three scenarios. In every version of this story, the outcome depends less on the quality of the policy design, which is by most serious assessments more sophisticated than anything Canada has attempted in decades, and more on whether the political and economic timing aligns in his favor. He needs the critical minerals investments to show visible results within 2 years. He needs Alberta to find enough alternative buyers to reduce its political resistance. He needs the administration in Washington to continue providing the external pressure that sustains Canadian public support for short-term pain. And he needs his own party to hold together around an agenda that is in several respects more structurally disruptive than anything his party has traditionally been comfortable delivering. That is a lot of dependencies for a man who is trying to end a dependency architecture. But here is the thing about this particular leader that you keep coming back to. The longer you look at his record, he has been in the room when the ground shifted before. In 2008, when the global financial system was breaking in real time, he made a decision at the Bank of Canada that required him to move faster than the conventional playbook allowed, and stake his institutional credibility on a commitment that had no recent precedent. It worked. In 2016, when Brexit was destabilizing the Bank of England and the British political establishment was fracturing, he provided the kind of calm, specific, forward-looking guidance that kept the institution credible through a crisis that had no clean resolution. He is not a man who panics. He is not a man who improvises. He is a man who reads structural conditions carefully, identifies the leverage point, and then makes a precisely targeted commitment that he intends to honor. The 70 cents era was always going to end. The only question was whether it would end on Canada's terms or on Washington's. This leader has decided that the answer to that question matters, and that the cost of deciding is lower than the cost of continuing to wait.